At Christmas dinner, my billionaire grandmother asked if I was still living in the house she bought me. I froze and told her I did not live in any house. She turned to my parents and their faces went pale. I am Zora, 32 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As an urban real estate developer, I escaped their toxicity, but maintained occasional contact. Last Christmas, I agreed to attend their lavish holiday dinner. Between the honey-glazed ham and the collard greens, my mother leaned forward smirking. "You know, Zora, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way." I simply sipped my wine and smiled. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in an affluent Atlanta suburb meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling mansion, emotional coldness permeated every corner. The air was thick with the scent of roasted turkey, baked macaroni and cheese, and expensive perfume. Our dining room, with its crystal chandeliers and custom mahogany table, was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My mother, Valerie, 55 years old and obsessed with high society, made sure every detail was flawless. From her tailored silk dress to her perfectly pressed hair, she projected an image of untouchable elite status. I sat at the far end of the table wearing a simple linen dress, and my natural locks pulled back into a neat bun. I liked my style. It was authentic. But to my mother, authenticity was a liability. She stared at me from across the table, her eyes raking over my unbranded clothing with clear disgust. "I do not understand why you insist on looking so unkempt," Valerie said loudly, ensuring all our extended relatives could hear. "We have an image to uphold in this community." Chloe manages to look presentable. "Why cannot you make an effort?" I glanced at my younger sister Chloe. At 30 years old, she was the undisputed golden child of the family. Chloe sat beside her husband DeAndre, dripping in a diamond tennis necklace and matching earrings that he had supposedly gifted her for the holidays. She flipped her perfectly straightened hair and offered a condescending smile. "Leave her alone, Mom," Chloe said, though her tone lacked any real sympathy. "Zora works in those rundown neighborhoods all day. You cannot expect her to understand high fashion." DeAndre, 33 and practically bursting out of his designer suit, chuckled and swirled his expensive bourbon. "It is all about mindset," he added smoothly. "Some people are built for luxury and wealth, and some people are built for the struggle. You just have to accept your lane, Zora." My father, Calvin, nodded in agreement from the head of the table. He always backed them up, reinforcing the idea that I was an embarrassment. I ignored their taunts. I was used to being the black sheep, the punching bag, the one they kept around just to feel better about their own shallow achievements. But the dynamic was about to shift permanently. Sitting directly across from me was Beatrice, affectionately known to the world as Big B. At 78 years old, my grandmother was a force of nature. She was a self-made billionaire who had built a massive black hair care empire back in the 1970s. She had started mixing products in her kitchen sink and turned it into a global enterprise. Grandma B did not tolerate fools, and she certainly did not tolerate disrespect. She had flown in from Chicago just for this dinner, wearing a sharp emerald green pantsuit and a vintage pearl necklace. Her mind was as brilliant as ever, and she watched the interaction between my mother, sister, and brother-in-law with narrowed eyes. Suddenly, Grandma B raised her crystal glass and clinked it firmly with a silver spoon. The sharp, clear, ringing sound instantly silenced the table. Everyone turned their attention to the matriarch of the family. Valerie immediately put on a bright, eager smile, ready to absorb whatever praise or attention her wealthy mother-in-law was about to offer. But Grandma B ignored Valerie completely. Her sharp, intelligent gaze bypassed my parents and locked directly onto me. "Zora, baby," Grandma B said, her voice rich and carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "Are you still living comfortably in that $1.5 million historic brownstone I bought for you 5 years ago?" The dining room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick Persian rug. The jovial, condescending energy that had filled the space evaporated in an instant. I paused my fork hovering halfway to my mouth. I blinked, genuinely confused by the question. I searched her face for any sign of a joke, but she was entirely serious. What house, Grandma? I asked, my voice steady but bewildered. I do not live in a brownstone. I rent a modest one-bedroom apartment in the city. I have been living there for the past 4 years. The silence that followed my words was thick and suffocating. It was a heavy, dangerous kind of quiet. I slowly turned my head to look at my parents. My father, Calvin, had stopped chewing. He began to cough violently, practically choking on his wine, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. My mother, Valerie, looked as though she had seen a ghost, all the color drained from her perfectly contoured face. Her flawless exterior seemed to crack right before my eyes. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her knuckles turned white. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Grandma B leaned back in her chair. Her expression hardened into something cold and unforgiving. Her voice dropped to a lethal register that sent a shiver down my spine. Calvin, Valerie. She began addressing them directly with a tone that demanded immediate answers. 5 years ago, when Zora turned 27, I wired exactly $1.5 million into the family trust account. I sent explicit legal instructions that those funds were to be used entirely to purchase a historic property for Zora. It was meant to serve as her initial startup capital and a permanent home so she could build her future with absolute security. She slammed her hand flat against the table. The sudden noise made everyone flinch. Where is the money? Where is my granddaughter's house? My father wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, avoiding eye contact with his mother. His hands were trembling. Mom, there was a misunderstanding. Calvin stammered, his voice weak and defensive. The real estate market was highly volatile at that time. We wanted to protect Zora from making a poor investment. We thought letting a professional handle the funds was safer. Before Calvin could dig himself any deeper, DeAndre stepped in. He flashed his signature fake venture capitalist smile, attempting to charm a woman who could buy and sell him 10 times over. Now, Grandma B, let us not overreact, DeAndre said smoothly, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. Zora completely lacks financial literacy. Giving her that much capital would have been a disaster. So Calvin and Valerie made the responsible parental decision. They entrusted the funds to me. I managed the money through my private equity firm. We integrated it into our portfolios to grow it safely. The money is safely invested. My sister Chloe nodded vigorously, her diamond earrings catching the light as she defended her husband. DeAndre is right, Grandma. Zora does not know how to manage real wealth. She would have wasted it on one of her little community projects. DeAndre actually saved her from bankruptcy. My parents were just looking out for her best interests. We are keeping it safe for her until she is ready. We are practically doing her a huge favor. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their deception. For 5 entire years, they had actively hidden a massive inheritance from me. They had watched me struggle to pay rent, taking on multiple jobs to fund my own small projects, while they sat on a fortune that was legally mine. They had allowed me to believe I was entirely on my own, unsupported and undervalued, while simultaneously stealing my financial foundation to prop up their own extravagant lifestyles. I did not cry. I did not yell. I carefully placed my linen napkin on the table and wiped my mouth. I looked directly at DeAndre, feeling a surge of calm, focused power wash over me. I smiled coldly. Safely invested, I asked, my voice slicing through the heavy tension in the room. Or did you use my money to settle the massive lawsuit from your last failed crypto scam? Valerie slammed her manicured hand against the custom mahogany dining table with such force that the crystal wine glasses violently rattled against each other. The deep crimson liquid splashed over the rim of my father's glass, staining the pristine white tablecloth like fresh blood. Instead of apologizing for the blatant theft of my $1.5 million inheritance, my mother went on the immediate offensive. This was her signature move. Whenever she was backed into a corner, she attacked. She pushed her chair back and stood up, towering over the holiday feast, her eyes blazing with a toxic mix of panic and pure venom. "How dare you speak to your brother-in-law that way?" Valerie shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the dining room. "You have absolutely no idea how the real world works, Zora. You sit there in your unbranded clothes with your unkempt natural locks looking like a common street vendor, and you have the audacity to question our financial decisions. You want to know why we did not just hand you that money. I will tell you exactly why. Because you do not belong in our world. You never have." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting lightly in my lap. I did not flinch as her words sliced through the air. Beside me, my grandmother Beatrice watched the scene unfold in stone-cold silence, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Valerie gestured wildly toward my sister Chloe, who was busy adjusting her massive diamond tennis necklace as if to make sure everyone was still looking at it. "Look at your sister," my mother demanded. "Chloe and DeAndre elevate this family. They host charity galas. They are board members of the most exclusive Jack and Jill chapters in Atlanta. They sit at tables with senators and real estate moguls. They bring prestige to our name. What do you do, Zora? You spend your days walking through run-down, dilapidated neighborhoods, playing in the dirt, trying to save inner-city buildings that should have been bulldozed decades ago. You drag our legacy straight back to the hood." My father, Calvin, stared down at his plate of honey-glazed ham, too much of a coward to meet my gaze or stop his wife. Chloe simply smiled, a smug, satisfied smirk playing on her glossy lips. She loved this. She had always thrived on my degradation. "Why on earth would we give $1.5 million to a girl who insists on living like a peasant?" Valerie continued, her voice reaching a shrill crescendo. DeAndre took that money and used it to buy Chloe a breathtaking estate in Buckhead, a home worthy of our social standing, a home where they can host the elite members of our community. That money was put to work to elevate our family name, not to be wasted on your pathetic little urban renewal fantasies. You should be thanking us for protecting the family wealth from your incompetence." The air in the room was thick, suffocatingly heavy with the weight of her prejudice. She had just confessed to grand larceny and tried to wrap it in a bow of upper-class elitism. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I simply picked up my linen napkin, dabbed the corner of my mouth, and locked eyes with the woman who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. "Elevate the family," I asked, my tone dangerously calm and completely unbothered. "Let us call this exactly what it is, Mother. You did not steal my future to elevate the family. You stole my future to fund Chloe's fake Instagram lifestyle because she fits your sick, twisted, colorist narrative." Valerie gasped, taking a dramatic step back, as if I had physically struck her. "Do not act shocked." I continued, my voice steady and cutting like glass. "We are going to speak the ugly truth today. You have spent your entire life obsessed with proximity to whiteness. You look at Chloe with her lighter skin and her looser curl pattern, and you see the ultimate prize. You see a trophy you can parade around your elite country clubs to prove you belong. But you look at me with my dark skin and my coarse hair, and you see a threat to your carefully curated social climbing. You did not invest in Chloe. You bought a prop. You bought a human billboard to advertise your desperate need for validation." Chloe slammed her hands on the table, her face turning a blotchy red. "Shut your mouth, Zora!" she yelled. "You are just jealous because I am the one living the luxury life while you are struggling in some tiny apartment. You have always been jealous of me." I turned my gaze to my sister, offering her a smile of pure pity. "Jealous of you, Chloe?" I asked softly. "Why would I be jealous of a woman who cannot even afford the diamonds around her own neck? You are 30 years old and still playing dress-up with stolen funds. You have no career, no ambition, and no identity outside of the fraudulent wealth your husband supposedly provides. I have spent the last 5 years building my own life with my own 2 hands. I know the value of $1 because I earned mine. You just spent mine." Valerie opened her mouth to scream another insult, but she was quickly interrupted by the scrape of a heavy wooden chair against the floor. DeAndre stood up. He buttoned the center button of his bespoke Italian suit, puffing out his chest as he tried to physically intimidate me from across the table. He stood at 6'3", a man used to using his size and his loud voice to bully women into submission. "Now you listen to me, Zora," DeAndre commanded, using that deep, arrogant corporate tone he used to manipulate his clients. "You are way out of your depth here. You are talking about things you fundamentally do not understand. Private equity, hedge funds, high-yield asset management. This is a grown man's game. You design floor plans for abandoned laundromats. You do not know the first thing about generating generational wealth." He began to pace slowly behind Chloe's chair, gesturing with his hands like a professor lecturing a slow student. "When your father came to me with the trust money, I did what any top-tier financial expert would do. I integrated it into a high-yield growth portfolio. I took that stagnant capital and I put it to work in the market. My fund consistently yields a 30% return year over year. Do you even know what that means? It means I am printing money. I am creating a financial fortress for this family that your little community projects could never touch in 100 lifetimes." Grandma B watched DeAndre with a look of absolute disgust, her hands resting heavily on her cane. Calvin was visibly sweating now, pulling at his collar as if the room had suddenly become a sauna. He knew the truth, and he knew DeAndre was digging them all into a massive grave. "You lack financial literacy," Zora DeAndre continued, stopping to lean over the table and point directly at me. "You let your emotions cloud your business judgment. If your father had given you that $1.5 million, you would have blown it on charity. You would have sunk it into some failing neighborhood and lost every dime. I took that capital and I multiplied it. Chloe's estate in Buckhead is an appreciating asset. The cars, the jewelry, the social connections we have built, those are all strategic investments. We are playing chess while you are playing checkers." He sneered, a look of pure, arrogant triumph on his face. "So instead of sitting here ruining Christmas dinner with your jealous whining about a house you never deserved, you should be on your knees thanking me. I am the one carrying this family into the top 1%. You should be grateful we even let you sit at this table." The dining room fell silent again, save for the crackling of the fireplace in the background. DeAndre stood tall, looking extremely pleased with his own monologue. Chloe looked up at him with utter adoration, fully buying into his delusion. Valerie nodded approvingly, her confidence returning as she felt validated by her son-in-law's aggressive mansplaining. Even my father Calvin managed a weak smile, desperately trying to cling to the lie DeAndre was spinning. I let the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable moment. I took a slow sip of my water, savoring the cool liquid, feeling the crisp chill slide down my throat. I enjoyed letting them feel victorious for those final few seconds. I watched the arrogant pride swell in their chests. They genuinely believed they had won. They thought their loud voices and expensive clothes could intimidate me into shrinking back into the shadows. They thought I was still the powerless girl they had trampled over for years. Then I smoothly reached down to the hardwood floor beside my chair. I unzipped my vintage leather tote bag and deliberately pulled out my tablet. I tapped the glass screen, entering my secure passcode, and brought up the official federal document I had downloaded just hours before arriving at this wretched holiday dinner. I rested the tablet gently on the table next to my plate. I looked back up at DeAndre, locking onto his eyes. The arrogant smirk was still plastered across his face, but a tiny flicker of uncertainty now twitched in his jaw. "A 30% return," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, echoing sharply in the quiet room. "That is truly fascinating, DeAndre. A financial miracle, really. So tell me, if your private equity fund is yielding such massive historic returns, why did your firm file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in federal court at exactly 8:00 yesterday morning?" I did not wait for DeAndre to find his voice. I tapped the screen-sharing icon on my iPad. A second later, the massive 75-inch smart TV mounted above the dining room fireplace flickered to life. The serene digital fireplace display vanished, replaced immediately by stark white federal court documents, highlighted bank statements, and brightly colored wire transfer logs. The bold black letters at the top of the main document read, "Chapter 11 Bankruptcy Petition." "What is the meaning of this?" Valerie demanded, her voice shrill as she squinted at the screen. "Turn that off right now, Zora. This is a family dinner." "This is a crime scene, Mother." I corrected her, stepping away from the table to stand beside the television like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "Pay attention. You might actually learn something about the real world." I pointed to the first highlighted section on the screen. "Here is the corporate filing for DeAndre and his elite high-yield growth fund. Notice the date and the official federal stamp. He filed for bankruptcy protection exactly 32 hours ago. His total listed assets are less than $12,000. His total liabilities exceed $14 million. And those liabilities are owed to some very dangerous, very unforgiving private investors who are actively hunting him down." DeAndre lunged forward, his face flushed a deep, dangerous purple. His chair crashed backwards onto the rug. "That is confidential corporate information. You hacked my accounts. I will have you arrested for federal wire fraud. I will destroy you." I laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the crystal stemware. "Hacked your accounts? DeAndre bankruptcy filings are public record. Anyone with a basic internet connection, a functioning brain, and a Pacer account can pull them up for 10 cents a page. You are not a criminal mastermind. You are just a common thief who got greedy and sloppy." I swiped my screen, bringing up a complex flowchart I had spent weeks building. The chart tracked multiple bank accounts, routing numbers, and offshore holding companies. "Let us break down your 30% returns," I said, keeping my eyes locked on DeAndre. "You did not invest a single dime of the money your clients gave you. You ran a classic textbook Ponzi scheme. You took new investor money to pay off the old investors, skimming millions off the top to fund your luxury lifestyle. But a few months ago, the well ran dry. New investors stopped coming in. The old investors wanted their payouts. You panicked. And right when you were about to go under, my father handed you my $1.5 million inheritance on a silver platter." Chloe stood up, her chair scraping violently against the floor. "Stop lying, Zora. DeAndre is a financial genius. He bought me the Buckhead estate with his own profits. You are just trying to embarrass us because Grandma is here." I swiped to the next slide. A massive high-resolution wire transfer receipt filled the screen. "Look at the date, Chloe. Look at the originating and receiving routing numbers. This shows a direct authorized transfer of $1.5 million from the Wilson Family Trust directly into DeAndre's personal holding company. 48 hours later, DeAndre wired $800,000 to an exotic auto dealership to purchase your 2 custom Mercedes G-Wagons, your imported sports car, and all the designer bags you flaunted on Instagram. The remaining $700,000 was immediately dispersed to 5 angry investors who were threatening to report DeAndre to the Securities and Exchange Commission for fraud. He did not buy your cars with his elite market profits. He bought them with my stolen startup capital." Chloe stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She looked down at the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, suddenly realizing it was bought with stolen money. DeAndre tried to reach for her arm, but she slapped his hand away, her eyes wild with panic. "You knew about this?" Grandma B asked. Her voice was no longer loud. It was a terrifying, deadly whisper. She clutched her cane with both hands, leaning heavily against it, her knuckles white. "How long have you known they stole your money, Zora?" I turned to my grandmother, softening my expression just a fraction. "I found out 8 months ago. I went to the bank to apply for a commercial development loan for a new project. The loan officer ran a routine background check on my family trust since my name is listed as a beneficiary. He flagged a massive irregular withdrawal. It took me months of digging through public records, shell companies, and shell corporations to track exactly where the money went. I stayed quiet because I needed undeniable proof. I needed to know exactly how deep the rot went in this family before I exposed it." Valerie began to hyperventilate. Her hands fluttered nervously around her neck, clutching at her expensive pearls. "This is a mistake. Calvin, tell them this is a mistake. Tell them DeAndre promised to pay it back with interest. We only lent him the money temporarily. We had a verbal agreement." "Lent him the money," Grandma B repeated slowly, turning her terrifying gaze toward my father. Calvin sat completely paralyzed at the head of the table. The confident patriarch who loved to lecture me about upholding the family image was now sweating profusely through his custom-tailored silk shirt. His hands were clamped tightly over his knees. "You took the money I explicitly set aside for your daughter, the daughter you threw away to the wolves, and you gave it to this con artist. You handed him her future." "Mom, please understand," Calvin begged, his voice cracking under the intense pressure of his mother's glare. DeAndre showed me his spreadsheets. He showed me the projected returns. He told me he was on the verge of taking his company public. He said if he just had a quick injection of capital, he could double the family trust in 6 months. I was trying to grow our wealth. I was doing it for the family. "You did it because you are a weak, gullible fool who wanted to impress his country club friends." Grandma B spat out, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "You sacrificed Zora to fund Chloe's fake prestige, and when the money disappeared, you hid it like a coward." I tapped my iPad one more time. Another document appeared on the television screen. This one had the letterhead of a major national bank. "But that is not the worst part, is it, Dad?" I asked, stepping closer to Calvin. When DeAndre burned through my $1.5 million, it still was not enough to keep his fraudulent company afloat. The angry investors kept coming. The lawsuits started piling up. DeAndre came crying to you again, begging for another bailout to keep himself out of federal prison. Calvin closed his eyes, shaking his head slowly, as if trying to physically deny the truth displayed on the glowing screen above him. His breathing was ragged, sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Tell them what you did, Dad," I demanded, my voice echoing off the walls. "Tell them how you saved your precious son-in-law." Calvin buried his face in his hands. A loud, wretched sob escaped his throat, destroying whatever dignity he had left. When the fund collapsed, DeAndre told me the SEC was preparing to indict him. Calvin confessed, the words pouring out in a pathetic, broken rush. He said if he went to prison, Chloe would be ruined. The family name would be dragged through the mud. I could not let that happen. We have a reputation in Atlanta. I had to protect Chloe. "So you committed financial suicide," I said, pointing to the bank document on the screen. When Calvin refused to speak, I read the document aloud for the room. 6 months ago, Calvin Wilson took out a massive high-interest commercial mortgage against this very estate, the house we are eating Christmas dinner in right now. You leveraged the entire family estate to borrow $3 million in cash. You handed all $3 million directly to DeAndre to quietly settle his pending lawsuits and pay off the rest of his investors. You thought you could cover it up before Grandma B found out. You thought DeAndre would miraculously make the money back. Valerie screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure terror. She grabbed Calvin's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. "You mortgaged the house. You put a lien on my home. Calvin, tell me she is lying. Tell me we still own this house." Calvin refused to look at her. He just kept his face buried in his hands, weeping openly. "The money is gone, Valerie. DeAndre lost it all in a bad options trade trying to win it back. We are broke. We cannot make the monthly payments. The bank sent the default notice last week." Grandma B moved with astonishing speed for a woman of 78. She raised her hand and delivered a stinging, open-handed slap directly across Calvin's cheek. The sharp crack echoed through the dining room. "You disgust me," she hissed. "You ruined this family to protect a thief." Calvin, desperate and humiliated, suddenly stood up. His cheek was bright red and his eyes were wild with cornered rage. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest, his face twisted in malice. "Fine. We lost it all. But that means you get nothing, Zora. The bank is foreclosing on me anyway. The bank is taking everything. So you can stand there and act superior, but you still lose. You are never getting your $1.5 million back. The bank owns this house, not you." I did not break eye contact. I slowly poured myself a glass of my grandmother's expensive red wine, letting the silence build. I took a slow sip, enjoying the rich, complex flavor, feeling completely in control. Then I smirked, offering my father a look of absolute chilling triumph. "You are right, Dad. The bank did own the house. But do you know which private equity firm the bank just sold your toxic debt to? Valerie barked a sharp, humorless laugh that sounded more like a cough. She stood up so quickly, her heavy wooden chair nearly toppled backward onto the Persian rug. "You are bluffing," Valerie shouted, pointing a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. "You are sitting there lying through your teeth just to ruin our holiday. You know absolutely nothing about private equity firms or bank debt. You are a college dropout who plays in the dirt with contractors." I took a slow breath, letting her desperation fill the room. My mother was unraveling her carefully constructed reality, shattering piece by piece. "You abandoned the prestigious internship we secured for you," Valerie continued, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. "You threw away a perfectly good corporate path to go work in some filthy community center, and now you want us to believe you have insider knowledge of high-level financial transactions. It is pathetic, Zora. You are pathetic. You are just angry because you are broke and jealous of your sister." Calvin eagerly grabbed onto his wife's delusional lifeline. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and forced a weak, condescending chuckle. "Your mother is right," Calvin said, adjusting his tie with shaking hands. "The bank does not just share confidential mortgage data with random struggling real estate developers. Commercial debt sales are handled behind closed doors by institutional investors. You do not have the clearance or the network to know anything about my mortgage. You probably just read an article about DeAndre's firm filing for bankruptcy and decided to make up a story to scare us." They were scrambling. They were desperately trying to stuff the genie back into the bottle, clinging to the familiar narrative that I was the incompetent black sheep. If they could just reduce me to the struggling disappointment they always claimed I was, then maybe their world would not collapse. I did not even bother to raise my voice to defend myself. I just sat there and let them talk in circles. I wanted them to exhaust their denial. "You have spent the last 5 years embarrassing this family," Valerie added, her eyes flashing with venom. "You show up to charity galas in off-the-rack dresses. You refuse to join our country club. You deliberately associate with people who have zero social standing. We tried to groom you for success, but you insisted on dragging yourself through the mud. And now you expect us to believe you are some kind of financial mastermind holding the keys to our estate. It is a joke. You are a joke." Calvin nodded vigorously. "We are done entertaining this nonsense," he declared, attempting to summon his lost patriarchal authority. "You can leave now, Zora. This dinner is over for you." But the illusion of control was already dead. Chloe had not heard a single word of our parents' desperate denial. Her wide, panicked eyes were locked entirely on her husband. Her perfect world of luxury and social media dominance was burning down around her, and she knew it. "You lied to me!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking as she shoved her chair away from the table. She rounded on DeAndre, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure rage. "You told me your fund was making millions. You told me the Buckhead estate was paid off in cash. Are you telling me my entire life is funded by a Ponzi scheme?" DeAndre took a step back, holding his hands up defensively. "Chloe, baby, listen to me," he pleaded, his smooth venture capitalist persona completely vanishing. "It was just a temporary cash flow problem. The market shifted unexpectedly. I just needed a little bridge capital to tide the firm over until the next quarter." "A temporary problem," Chloe shrieked, striking him hard on the chest with both hands. "You filed for bankruptcy. You stole my sister's money to buy my car. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? My friends are going to find out. The country club board will laugh at me. You have made me a laughingstock. I am going to be broke." DeAndre dropped his facade. The suave, loving husband act vanished instantly, revealing the cowardly opportunist underneath. He violently swatted Chloe's hands away and shoved her backward. She stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the mahogany table. "Shut your mouth!" DeAndre yelled, his face turning a blotchy red. "You did not seem to care where the money came from when you were swiping your black card in Paris. You loved spending the cash. You loved the jewelry and the cars. Do not act like some innocent victim now." He spun around and pointed an accusing finger at Calvin. "And you," DeAndre spat, glaring at my father, "do not stand there pretending I forced you to do anything. You are a greedy old fool. You practically begged me to take your money. You handed over Zora's trust fund because I promised you a 20% kickback off the books. And when the fund started bleeding, you voluntarily mortgaged this house because you were terrified Grandma B would find out you lost her initial investment. You signed those bank papers, Calvin. You handed me that $3 million. You are just as guilty as I am. Calvin's face contorted with fury. I trusted you, he roared, lunging forward. I mortgaged my legacy to save you from federal prison, and you blew it on bad trades. You ruined my life. The dining room descended into absolute chaos. The perfect elite family dynamic they had projected for decades shattered into a million jagged pieces. Chloe was sobbing hysterically, screaming about her ruined reputation. Calvin and DeAndre were standing chest to chest, shouting obscenities and blaming each other for the financial ruin they had co-authored. Valerie was running between them, screaming for everyone to stop, desperately trying to protect her expensive crystal glasses from being knocked off the table in the scuffle. I remained firmly in my seat. I reached across the table, grabbed the heavy crystal decanter, and calmly poured myself a fresh glass of Grandma B's Reserve Cabernet. The rich, dark red wine swirled beautifully in the glass. I took a slow, appreciative sip. The taste of victory was sweet cold and incredibly satisfying. Beside me, Grandma B sat perfectly still. She was not shouting. She was not intervening. She was just watching the carnage with cold, hard eyes, leaning on her silver-handled cane. She briefly glanced at me, and a tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of her lips. She recognized exactly what I was doing. I let them scream until their throats were raw. I let them tear each other apart like wild animals fighting over scraps. When the shouting finally began to die down into exhausted, heavy panting, I set my wineglass down with a sharp clink. The sound cut through their heavy breathing. You spent the last 5 years playing dress-up, I said, my voice quiet but carrying effortlessly across the ruined dinner table. You wore stolen diamonds and drove stolen cars. You bought a fake life with my money and spent every waking moment trying to convince the world you were royalty. They all turned to look at me, their faces flushed and streaked with sweat. But while you were busy posing for cameras and playing pretend, I was actually working. I continued, my voice steady and relentless. When you cut me off and left me to starve, I did not cry. I went to work. I spent 5 years grinding in the commercial real estate market. I spent sleepless nights negotiating deals in dingy 24-hour diners. I built a network of contractors, investors, and city planners. I bought up abandoned commercial districts that people like you turned your noses up at. I renovated them. I brought in Black-owned businesses. I revitalized entire city blocks while you were busy stealing from your own blood. Valerie stared at me, her chest heaving. You expect us to believe you built an empire from nothing, she sneered, though her voice lacked its earlier venom. I expect you to realize that you completely underestimated the person you spent your life abusing, I replied smoothly. You thought denying me money would break me. You thought I needed your country club connections to survive. But being the black sheep of this family was the greatest gift you ever gave me. It taught me how to survive in the dirt. It taught me how to build from the ground up. You stole my starting line, but you could never steal my hustle. Valerie's eyes darted frantically around the room. She was backed into a corner, completely stripped of her wealth and her pride. Desperate to regain the upper hand, she slammed her hands flat onto the mahogany table. It does not matter who bought the debt, Valerie screamed, her voice cracking with pure desperation. I still have the promissory note you signed when you were 22. You owe us $100,000 and I will sue you for every single penny. I laughed out loud, a bright, genuinely amused sound. You mean the note you forged? Valerie's hand shook violently as she reached into her quilted Chanel bag. She bypassed her designer lipstick and compact, pulling out a crisp, neatly folded piece of paper. She slammed it onto the table so hard, her heavy diamond rings clacked sharply against the polished wood. This is your signature, she declared, her voice vibrating with a manic, desperate triumph. You came to us begging for seed money when your pathetic little startup was failing. We lent you $100,000, and the note clearly states it is payable upon demand. We are calling the note due today, Zora. So if anyone is going bankrupt and losing everything, it is you. I leaned forward, bracing my forearms casually on the edge of the table. I did not even bother picking up the piece of paper. I just stared at the date printed at the top right corner in bold black ink. October 14th, 2019. A masterpiece of legal fiction, I said, looking up to meet her panicked, wide-eyed gaze. There is just one glaring problem with your timeline, Mother. It is your exact signature, she snapped, jabbing her index finger at the bottom line. Do not try to lie your way out of this. You owe us this money. It is a digital trace of my signature lifted straight from a college loan application you kept in your files, I corrected her, my tone dropping to a dead, icy calm. On October 14th, 2019, I was not sitting in your immaculate study begging for a handout. I was unconscious in the intensive care unit at Emory University Hospital. Valerie's jaw snapped shut with an audible click. The blood drained from her face, leaving her expensive foundation looking stark and unnatural against her suddenly pale skin. Remember that week I asked the words slicing through the heavy, suffocating silence of the dining room? I had double pneumonia. My lungs were filling with fluid. I was intubated for 3 straight days, fighting for my life, unable to speak or move. Do you know how I know you remember? Because the hospital billing department called you my designated emergency contact to ask for an insurance copay. And you told the admissions nurse that I was a college dropout who was no longer your financial responsibility, and hung up the phone. Calvin shifted his gaze to the floor, staring at the intricate floral patterns of the rug, completely unable to look at me or his mother. I could not breathe on my own, let alone hold a pen to sign a fraudulent promissory note. I continued tapping the piece of paper with my finger. But please, Mother, take this to court. I would absolutely love to watch a federal judge cross-reference this date with my official medical records and then ask why you tried to extort $100,000 from your own daughter to cover your son-in-law's criminal gambling debts. We were teaching you a lesson, Valerie stammered, her voice dropping to a desperate, reedy whisper. She looked frantically around the room for support, hoping Calvin or Chloe would step in, but found none. You refused to listen to us. You refused to take the corporate job your father arranged for you. You had to learn how the real world works. You had to hit rock bottom to understand our value and respect our authority. Oh, I learned! I shot back, my voice rising with a controlled, righteous heat that made her flinch. I learned exactly how the real world works when they discharged me with an oxygen tank and an $80,000 medical bill. You thought that debt would break me. You thought I would come crawling back to this house on my hands and knees, begging to answer phones at Dad's firm just to keep the collection agencies from destroying my credit score. We left the door open for you, Calvin muttered to his shoes, his voice weak and defensive, lacking any of his usual bravado. All you had to do was apologize and fall in line. You always had to be so incredibly stubborn. Fall in line to fund this fake empire, I scoffed, gesturing widely around the lavish, suffocating room, pointing at the crystal chandelier and the imported art. No thanks. While you two were busy buying Chloe her 3rd engagement ring upgrade to post on social media, I was living in a 200-square-foot studio apartment above a noisy laundromat. I ate generic rice and beans for 18 straight months. I rode the city bus in the freezing rain to every commercial zoning meeting in Atlanta until the city planners knew me by my first name. Chloe crossed her arms defensively, her tear-streaked face twisting into a bitter scowl. Nobody asked you to be a martyr, Zora. You chose to live like trash. That was your own stupid decision. And nobody asked you to be a parasite, yet here we are, I snapped, silencing her instantly as she shrank back into her chair. I turned back to my parents, the anger I had buried for 5 long years finally boiling to the surface. You cut off my phone. You took me off the health insurance. You went to the bank and intentionally removed your names as guarantors on my student loans the day before my senior year tuition was due. You systematically tried to starve me out of my own future so I would be forced to submit to your absolute control. Valerie gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles stark white against the wood. We gave you life, Zora. We put a roof over your head. You owe us your respect. And then you tried to ruin my life because I would not be your obedient puppet. I replied, feeling an immense liberating weight lift off my shoulders with every word. Every time I pitched a development project, I had to work 10 times harder because the Wilson name was suddenly a massive liability. Dad, you actually called my first major investor behind my back and told him I was mentally unstable. You tried to tank my first commercial deal just to teach me a lesson and keep me firmly in my place. Calvin finally looked up, his eyes defensive and watery. I was protecting a colleague from a bad investment. You were 24 with zero capital and no proven track record. I was 24 with a better business plan than you ever had in your entire life. I fired back, leaning in close so he could see the absolute conviction in my eyes. And that investor ignored you. He saw my vision and he gave me the seed money anyway. I flipped that abandoned warehouse into a tech hub that sold for $4 million. I built a thriving firm out of the dirt you threw on me. I do not owe you a dime, I do not owe you an apology, and I certainly do not owe you a single ounce of my respect. The sharp, authoritative tap of Grandma B's cane on the hardwood floor silenced the room instantly. Everyone froze mid-breath. The matriarch of the Wilson family had heard enough. She slowly rose from her antique dining chair, violently batting away Calvin's instinctive reach to help her stand. She stood tall, an imposing figure wrapped in tailored cashmere, her face a mask of absolute glacial fury. "You called her unstable, Grandma B," repeated her voice dripping with icy venom as she glared down at her cowering son. "You tried to sabotage your own daughter's business to feed your fragile, pathetic ego." "Mama, please." Calvin begged, his hands raised in a gesture of panicked surrender. "I was trying to guide her. I wanted her to be safe." "You were trying to break her!" Grandma B snapped, her voice echoing like a gunshot through the vaulted ceiling. "Just like you let this fraudulent clown break our family trust." She jabbed her heavy silver-handled cane toward DeAndre, who flinched and backed away until he hit the mahogany sideboard, knocking over a silver candlestick. Grandma B turned her piercing gaze back to Calvin, stripping away every ounce of his pride and leaving him completely exposed. "I handed you a legacy. My husband and I built the foundation of this family's wealth with sweat and blood, fighting through doors that were locked to people who look like us. We gave you everything, Calvin. We sent you to the best private schools. We bought your first law firm. We paved your entire road with gold. And what did you do with it? You used it to play God. You used it to spoil one child who has absolutely no spine and to terrorize another child who has more grit than you will ever possess." Valerie tried to intervene, tears completely ruining her expensive makeup, leaving dark, muddy streaks down her cheeks. "B, we are family. We can fix this. DeAndre will find a way out of the bankruptcy, or we can sell some assets. We can downsize the cars. We just need a little help to get through the month until the dust settles." "Help," Grandma B scoffed, looking at Valerie as if she were a roach stuck to the bottom of her shoe. "You forged a legal document to extort a sick child. You mortgaged the home I helped you buy to bail out a criminal. There's no fixing this, Valerie. You are entirely bankrupt morally and financially. You are a disgrace." She turned her back on her weeping daughter-in-law and faced Calvin, delivering the final fatal blow to his ego. "Listen to me very carefully, Calvin. As of this exact moment, you are no longer the executor of the Wilson Family Trust. Tomorrow morning, my attorneys will officially file the paperwork to remove you permanently. You will not see another penny from me. You are out of the will. You are cut off entirely. As far as I am concerned, I have only one heir left in this room, and her name is Zora." Valerie gasped, her hands flying to her throat as if she were choking. The realization hit her with the force of a speeding freight train. The Billionaire gravy train had officially derailed. She began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest as she sank heavily into her chair, gasping for air as the reality set in that her country club days, her gala invitations, and her entire identity were permanently over. While the room remained entirely focused on Valerie's dramatic collapse and Calvin's silent, pathetic weeping, DeAndre recognized that his final shield had vanished. He silently backed away from the dining table, his eyes darting nervously toward the exits. He grabbed his car keys from the sideboard and turned toward the back hallway leading to the garage, hoping to slip out unnoticed. Just as his sweaty hand grasped the heavy brass doorknob, a deafening crash echoed through the mansion. The massive oak front doors were violently kicked open, splintering the expensive wood doorframe. Heavy boots stomped onto the pristine marble foyer. Three tall men wearing sharp, dark-tailored suits and grim, unforgiving expressions stepped into the entryway, fanning out instantly to block every possible escape route. The sound of the heavy oak doors splintering against the interior walls sent a physical shockwave through the dining room. Valerie gasped loudly, her hands flying defensively to her throat to clutch her expensive pearls. She stared in absolute horror at the three imposing men standing in her pristine foyer. They wore immaculate charcoal gray suits, crisp white shirts, and dark silk ties. Their faces were carved from granite, betraying zero emotion as their sharp eyes scanned the chaotic scene unfolding before them. Valerie's mind, desperately trying to reject the reality of her impending bankruptcy and the total destruction of her social standing, immediately miscategorized the threat. She looked at the tailored suits and the heavy leather briefcases and assumed these were bank representatives. She genuinely believed the mortgage lender had sent high-level corporate agents to physically serve the foreclosure papers and initiate a lockout on Christmas Day. A switch forcefully flipped in her brain. The weeping, hyperventilating woman vanished, replaced instantly by the arrogant country club socialite who believed she could manipulate any situation with a fake smile and a name drop. She hastily smoothed her ruined hair, wiped the smeared mascara from her cheeks with the back of her hand, and plastered on a sickeningly sweet, terrifyingly hollow smile. Valerie stepped out of the dining room and marched directly into the foyer to intercept them, deliberately blocking their path. "Gentlemen, please, there is absolutely no need for such an aggressive entrance into my home," Valerie announced, projecting her best high society voice. "I am Valerie Wilson. You are standing in the private residence of Calvin Wilson, senior partner, at one of the most prestigious law firms in the state of Georgia. I understand you are here regarding the temporary delinquency on the estate mortgage, but kicking our doors open is highly unprofessional." The three men did not blink. They did not slow their pace, nor did they acknowledge her greeting. They simply stepped around her, as if she were a piece of misplaced furniture. Valerie panicked, rushing to keep up with them as they moved toward the dining room. "Listen to me," she demanded, her fake smile straining at the edges. "This is simply a minor banking error. We are experiencing a temporary liquidity issue due to a delayed corporate merger. My husband is personal friends with the president of your bank. We play tennis with the regional director every single Sunday. If you just give us a 30-day extension, I assure you the entire balance will be settled in cash. I can write you a personal check for the late fees right now. Would you like a glass of champagne while we sort this out?" The men completely ignored her desperate, frantic babbling. They did not even turn their heads to look at her. Across the room, DeAndre was pressed flat against the floral wallpaper near the back hallway. His eyes bulged from his skull with pure, unadulterated terror. He did not look at the three men and see bank agents looking for mortgage payments. DeAndre saw federal investigators. He saw Securities and Exchange Commission enforcers. Worse, he saw corporate muscle hired by the furious, defrauded investors he had systematically robbed over the last 3 years. His entire confident venture capitalist persona disintegrated in an instant. His knees literally buckled, sending him sliding down the wall until he was crouching on the hardwood floor. He threw both of his hands high into the air, a gesture of absolute pathetic surrender. "I will cooperate," DeAndre screamed, his voice cracking hysterically over Valerie's polite begging. "I have all the ledgers. I kept the hidden servers. I will tell you everything you want to know. I will wear a wire. Just please do not hurt me. I am a victim here." Chloe stared at her husband in disgusted disbelief. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, stomping her foot. "Get up! You are embarrassing me." DeAndre ignored his wife entirely. He scrambled forward on his knees, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at Calvin, who was still standing near the head of the ruined dinner table. It was him, DeAndre yelled, tears of absolute panic streaming down his face. Calvin Wilson orchestrated the entire thing. He is the mastermind. He forced me to take that $3 million mortgage money to cover up his own illicit offshore gambling debts. I was just a pawn. I was just following his legal advice. He threatened to have me killed if I did not launder the money through my private equity fund. I am a hostage to his corporate manipulation. I will testify against him in federal court tomorrow. Calvin's face contorted into a mask of pure murderous rage. He grabbed a heavy silver serving fork from the table and lunged toward his son-in-law. "I will kill you!" Calvin roared, his voice hoarse and broken. "I will have you disbarred and thrown in a federal penitentiary for the rest of your miserable life. You stole my money. You ruined my family," Chloe screamed, grabbing Calvin by the sleeve of his suit jacket to pull him back, while Valerie shrieked and tried to physically position herself between the warring men. The perfect elite family dynamic had completely devolved into a vicious, screaming, feral blame game. They were throwing each other to the wolves without a second of hesitation, desperate to save their own skins. Through the deafening symphony of wealthy criminals turning on each other, the three men in suits remained entirely unfazed. They watched the spectacle with the cold, detached interest of scientists observing insects in a glass jar. The lead lawyer, a tall, sharp, incredibly imposing African-American man with striking silver hair at his temples, finally stepped fully into the dining room. His name was Julian. He was my chief legal counsel, and he moved with an aura of absolute, undisputed authority. His polished leather shoes clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. Valerie frantically grabbed Julian's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. "Please, sir, you have to listen to me," she begged, all pretense of high society manners entirely gone. "We can sell the cars. We can liquidate my jewelry collection. We can give you the deed to my mother's house. Just do not evict us today. Do not put our belongings on the street on Christmas." Julian stopped moving. He slowly turned his head to look down at Valerie's hand clutching his sleeve. His expression was so intensely cold, so utterly devoid of warmth or pity, that Valerie instantly gasped and snatched her hand back as if the fabric had burned her. Julian did not speak to her. He did not acknowledge Calvin's screaming or DeAndre's pathetic sobbing. He simply adjusted his gold cufflinks and continued walking right past them. He walked past Chloe, who was hyperventilating against the wall. He walked past Calvin, who was sweating and swearing. He walked past Grandma B, who watched him with a look of profound, silent approval. Julian stopped directly in front of my chair. I did not move. I remained perfectly seated, resting comfortably against the high back of the dining chair. I casually lifted my crystal glass and took another slow, deliberate sip of Grandma B's expensive red wine. I savored the vintage feeling, the warmth spread through my chest, while my family tore themselves to pieces in the background. I had spent the last 5 years grinding in the unforgiving trenches of the commercial real estate market. I had walked through rat-infested warehouses with a flashlight and a clipboard. I had sat in dingy, fluorescent-lit municipal offices for 12 hours a day, fighting for zoning permits. I had built a massive, impenetrable network of contractors, investors, city council members, and corporate attorneys, while Calvin and Valerie were busy playing dress-up at charity galas. While DeAndre was printing fake bank statements to buy Chloe a fleeting moment of Instagram fame, I was quietly buying up the very ground they walked on. I had built an urban development firm from the mud, relying on nothing but my own ruthless intellect and absolute refusal to fail. Julian stood before me and bowed his head slightly, a gesture of profound, undeniable respect. He reached into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy leather-bound portfolio. He placed it gently on the mahogany dining table directly next to my iPad. The heavy thud of the portfolio hitting the wood finally cut through the screaming. Calvin froze. DeAndre stopped babbling. Valerie covered her mouth with her hands. The entire room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence as they all turned to stare at the thick stack of legal documents resting in front of me. Julian turned slowly to face the room, his dark eyes sweeping over the terrified faces of my family. He did not raise his voice, but his words carried the weight of an executioner's gavel. "Madam Chairman, the acquisition of the Zenith Holdings portfolio is complete," Julian announced to the silent room. We hold the deeds to every property on this block. The words hung in the dead air of the dining room. Madam Chairman. The title echoed off the vaulted ceiling and sank into the heavy, suffocating silence. Valerie blinked rapidly, her mouth slightly open, completely unable to process the phrase Julian had just spoken. Calvin stared at the thick leather portfolio resting on the table as if it were a live explosive device. DeAndre remained frozen against the floral wallpaper, his eyes darting wildly between Julian and the other two corporate lawyers, standing like stone sentinels in the foyer. Madam Chairman Valerie whispered, her voice trembling, as she looked from the imposing lawyer to me. What is he talking about, Zora? Who is he calling Madam Chairman? I did not answer her immediately. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. I smoothed the front of my simple, unbranded linen dress, the exact dress Valerie had insulted just an hour ago. I stepped over to the mahogany table and rested my hand flat against the cool leather of the portfolio. Julian stepped back, offering me the floor with a respectful nod. Zenith Holdings, I said, my voice ringing out with absolute clarity. It is an anonymous private equity and commercial real estate firm I founded 4 years ago. You see, Mother, while you and Calvin thought I was wasting my life playing in the dirt with struggling community centers, I was actually buying the dirt. I was buying the abandoned buildings. I was buying the dilapidated strip malls and the forgotten urban districts that your wealthy country club friends ignored. Calvin's face went completely gray. His jaw slacked as the reality of my words began to penetrate his thick skull. Zenith Holdings. Calvin choked out, gripping the edge of the table to keep himself upright. Zenith is a billion-dollar corporate entity. They own half the commercial real estate in the downtown sector. You cannot possibly be the founder of Zenith. I smiled, tapping my manicured nail against the leather portfolio. I started small, I explained, looking directly into my father's terrified eyes. I took the small seed money I secured from that investor you tried to sabotage. I bought a single abandoned warehouse, renovated it, and leased it exclusively to Black-owned tech startups. It was incredibly profitable, so I leveraged that property to buy another, then another. I partnered with city planners to create tax incentive zones. I gentrified entire commercial districts, but kept the ownership within the community. I built a massive, untouchable urban real estate empire while you were busy showing off rented luxury cars and pretending to be rich. Valerie shook her head violently, her perfectly styled hair falling out of place. No, she shrieked, her voice cracking with denial. This is a lie. You are just a dropout. You live in a tiny apartment. You do not even own a designer handbag. I live in that apartment because I prefer it, Valerie. I corrected her sharply. I do not need to wear my wealth on my sleeve to prove my worth. I do not need a diamond tennis necklace to know I have power. I pour my capital into acquiring assets, not liabilities. Zenith Holdings generates more liquid revenue in a single fiscal quarter than your husband's law firm has generated in the last 20 years. I am the sole owner, the founder, and the CEO. Grandma B let out a low, rumbling chuckle. The sound was rich and entirely devoid of shock. She pounded her silver-handled cane against the floor once, twice, nodding her head in profound approval. I always knew you had my blood in your veins, Zora, she said quietly. You let them dig their own graves while you bought the cemetery. I unclasped the brass latch on the portfolio and flipped it open. The crisp, heavily notarized legal documents inside represented the absolute destruction of Calvin and Valerie's fake reality. I carefully extracted a thick stack of papers stapled together with a blue legal backing and tossed it directly in front of Calvin. It landed with a heavy final thud. Let us talk about this house, I said, leaning over the table. When DeAndre's fraudulent scheme collapsed, you panicked, Dad. You went to a major national bank and took out a high-interest $3 million commercial mortgage against this family estate. You gave that cash to DeAndre and he lost it. You defaulted on the loan. You missed 3 consecutive payments. The bank sent you a final notice of default last week. Calvin stared at the blue document, his chest heaving. He did not reach for it. He already knew what it was. Banks absolutely hate toxic commercial debt. I continued pacing slowly behind my chair, holding the room hostage with every word. They hate the legal hassle of foreclosures and evictions. So when a borrower like you defaults on a massive loan, the bank quietly packages that debt and sells it on the secondary market to private equity firms for pennies on the dollar. It is a very common practice to offload risk. I stopped pacing and locked eyes with my father. Zenith Holdings was the highest bidder in that secondary market auction yesterday morning. My firm bought your toxic debt, Calvin. Valerie let out a strangled, breathless sound. She pressed both hands to her cheeks, her eyes darting frantically around the dining room, looking at the crystal chandelier, the imported rugs, and the antique furniture. That means I hold the promissory note to this property, I stated, dropping the final crushing truth onto their heads. I am the bank. I own the mortgage. I own the land. I own the roof over your head. I own the dining. Completely annihilated. He was a ruined man, entirely at the mercy of the daughter he had spent years trying to break. Valerie could not accept it. She lunged forward, grabbing the blue document and frantically flipping through the pages. She scanned the dense legal jargon, searching for a loophole, searching for any proof that this was an elaborate hoax. When she reached the final page and saw the official county seals and the Zenith Holdings corporate watermark, she dropped the papers as if they were on fire. She backed away from the table, hyperventilating, her chest rising and falling in sharp, jagged gasps. The billionaire gravy train had not just derailed. It had exploded, leaving her stranded in the wreckage of her own arrogance. I did not give them a moment to breathe. The surgical strike was not over. I turned my attention away from my ruined parents and locked onto my sister. Chloe was pressed against the far wall, her arms wrapped tightly around her stomach. Her designer makeup was ruined by streaks of black mascara. She was shaking visibly, staring at me with a mixture of absolute terror and confusion. She had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself, and now she was looking up at me from the bottom of a very deep, very dark hole. "Oh, and sis," I said, my voice dripping with false sweetness. Chloe flinched, pressing herself harder against the wall. "Do not talk to me, Zora," she cried out, her voice high and panicked. "Leave me alone. I did not do anything to you." I picked up a second, thinner document from the leather portfolio. I held it up so the harsh dining room light caught the bright red foreclosure stamp across the front page. That beautiful, massive estate in Buckhead. I began watching Chloe's eyes widen in pure horror. "The one DeAndre supposedly bought for you to elevate the family name. The one where you host your exclusive Jack and Jill charity events. DeAndre did not buy that house in cash. He used my stolen $1.5 million for the down payment to secure the mortgage." Chloe looked desperately at DeAndre, but he refused to meet her gaze. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, sweating profusely through his bespoke Italian suit. "When his Ponzi scheme went under, DeAndre stopped paying your mortgage too," I revealed, taking a step toward her. "The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings on your Buckhead mansion last month. You probably did not know because DeAndre has been hiding the mail from you. But the bank moved quickly. They put the property up for a private expedited auction yesterday afternoon." Chloe shook her head side to side, her hands coming up to pull at her hair. "No, no, no," she muttered over and over again. "My house, my friends, my life. I bought it," I said, delivering the double tap with absolute precision. "Zenith Holdings purchased the Buckhead estate at auction. The deed transferred to my firm this morning. I am now your landlord, Chloe, and since you currently possess zero legal right to occupy the premises and your husband is a bankrupt fraudster facing federal prison time, I have already initiated immediate eviction proceedings. My lawyers have the paperwork ready for you to sign before you leave this house today." Chloe let out a gut-wrenching primal scream. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire identity burn to ash. Her expensive clothes, her luxury cars, her elite social circle, all of it was a complete and utter illusion, and the illusion had just shattered. She dropped heavily to her knees, her designer dress pooling around her on the floor. She turned her venomous, tear-soaked face toward DeAndre. "You ruined me," Chloe screamed at the top of her lungs, crawling toward him and pounding her fists wildly against his legs. "You made me a fraud. You made me homeless. I have nothing. I am a joke. I hate you. You are a disgusting, pathetic liar. DeAndre finally pushed past his breaking point, violently shoved Chloe away. She tumbled backward onto the rug, gasping in shock. He stood over her, his face twisted in a vicious, ugly sneer. His cowardly nature fully took over, lashing out at the easiest target in the room. "Shut up!" DeAndre roared, his voice echoing violently in the chaotic room. "You shallow, useless brat. Do not sit there on the floor and judge me. Do not act like you are completely innocent." Chloe stared up at him, her mouth open in stunned silence. "At least I tried to fix my mistakes," DeAndre screamed, pointing a furious finger directly at her face. "At least I tried to keep the money flowing. You are worse than I am. Do you want to talk about stealing, Chloe? Do you want to talk about being a criminal? Let us tell everyone where you got the cash to buy your new wardrobe last week. Let us tell Zora the truth. At least I did not steal from Grandma's cancer charity like you did." The silence that followed DeAndre's vicious accusation lasted only a fraction of a second before the entire dining room erupted into a deafening roar of absolute chaos. Grandma B's eyes went incredibly wide, losing their cold, calculated glare for the very first time tonight. She gripped the silver handle of her cane so hard her knuckles turned a stark, translucent white. Chloe let out a piercing, hysterical shriek, scrambling backward on the Persian rug like a cornered animal trying to escape a vicious predator. "You are a liar!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking as she wildly pointed a shaking, manicured finger at her husband. "You are a disgusting, pathetic liar trying to drag me down with your sinking ship." But DeAndre was too desperate to back down. He was a drowning man, grabbing onto anyone he could pull under the freezing water with him. "I am not lying," DeAndre yelled, stepping toward her and jabbing his finger aggressively in the air. "Tell them the truth, Chloe. Tell your precious grandmother how you actually funded your 6-week luxury excursion to Dubai. Tell them how you bought 5 Birkin bags in a single month when my private equity firm was already bleeding cash and missing corporate payroll." Calvin stepped forward, his fists balled tightly at his sides, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. "Shut your mouth," DeAndre, Calvin roared, spraying spit across the table. "Do not you dare accuse my daughter of a federal crime to cover your own gross incompetence." DeAndre laughed, a harsh, manic sound that bordered on genuine lunacy. "She is a criminal, Calvin. Your perfect golden child is a thief. She had full access to the foundation accounts because Valerie put her on the charity advisory board. Chloe forged the vendor invoices. She set up dummy catering corporations and funneled $200,000 of breast cancer donation money directly into her personal offshore accounts. I saw the bank transfers. I saw the routing numbers." Grandma B let out a low, strangled gasp. Her foundation was her life's work, a sacred memorial built specifically to honor her late sister. To hear that her own granddaughter had pillaged it to buy designer purses and fund extravagant vacations was a betrayal that cut deeper than any corporate bankruptcy ever could. "How could you?" Grandma B whispered, her voice barely carrying over the shouting, yet somehow cutting through the noise with razor-sharp precision. Chloe scrambled to her feet, her designer dress wrinkled and stained with spilled wine. She looked frantically around the room, her eyes darting from DeAndre to Calvin and finally landing on Valerie. "Mommy, it is not true," Chloe sobbed, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure, desperate panic. "He is making it all up to save himself. You know I would never do something like that. I am your daughter." Valerie immediately rushed forward, wrapping her arms protectively around her weeping, hyperventilating daughter. Her maternal instincts kicked into overdrive, blinding her completely to the glaring reality of the situation. She shot a venomous glare at DeAndre and then turned her furious attention to Julian and the other corporate lawyers standing stoically in the foyer. "This is an absolute outrage," Valerie declared, her voice reaching a shrill, highly defensive pitch. "My daughter is a pillar of this community. She is a dedicated philanthropist. If there are any discrepancies in the foundation ledgers, it is simply a clerical error, a minor misallocation of funds by an incompetent accountant. You cannot seriously believe the desperate lies of a man facing federal prison time over my daughter." Julian did not even blink. He adjusted his gold wire glasses, completely unbothered by Valerie's hysterical defense. With a calm, deliberate motion, he reached into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a slim manila folder. "We do not rely on the desperate claims of failing venture capitalists, Mrs. Wilson," Julian stated, his deep baritone voice effortlessly commanding the room. "We rely entirely on forensic accounting." He stepped forward and placed the folder on the dining table, sliding it precisely until it rested directly in front of Grandma B. When Zenith Holdings acquired the debt portfolio for this estate, we conducted a comprehensive financial audit of all assets and liabilities tied to Calvin Wilson's name, Julian explained smoothly. That audit naturally extended to the charitable foundation, given that Calvin serves as the primary legal trustee. The digital footprint was remarkably easy to track. Julian tapped the folder with a long, elegant finger. Inside that file are the routing numbers, the IP addresses, and the encrypted offshore account ledgers. Chloe Wilson authorized 47 separate wire transfers over a period of 8 months. The IP addresses match her personal laptop and her mobile device perfectly. The funds were routed through a shell company registered in Delaware and deposited directly into an account in the Cayman Islands. An account that is solely registered under Chloe's maiden name. Valerie stared at the manila folder as if it contained a venomous snake. She slowly backed away from Chloe, her arms dropping heavily to her sides. The fierce, protective mother act evaporated instantly as the undeniable weight of the evidence crushed her final delusion. Chloe let out a pitiful, whiny sob and tried to grab her mother's arm, but Valerie flinched and violently pulled away. "Do not touch me," Valerie whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of horror and profound disgust. Chloe turned her desperate, pleading eyes to Calvin, but her father had already turned his back to her. He was staring blankly at the wall, completely destroyed by the realization that his entire legacy was built on fraud, theft, and lies. The golden child, the perfect daughter, who could do absolutely no wrong, was officially exposed as a greedy, manipulative criminal. Chloe sank back onto the floor, pulling her knees tightly to her chest and weeping uncontrollably. The perfect, curated social media life she had spent years cultivating was completely obliterated. There would be no more country club galas. There would be no more magazine features. There would only be federal indictments, public humiliation, and absolute ruin. I watched her crumble, feeling no pity whatsoever. She had spent her entire life tearing me down to build herself up. She had worn my stolen money like a badge of honor, parading her fake wealth, while I ate generic rice and beans in a freezing apartment. This was not a tragedy. This was gravity finally pulling her back down to earth. DeAndre realized immediately that the room was entirely consumed by Chloe's spectacular downfall. His accusation had worked perfectly as a distraction. He saw his window of opportunity closing rapidly. While Valerie wept and Calvin stared blankly at the wall, DeAndre silently edged backward, inching his way toward the ornate hallway that led to the master suite. He knew exactly what he was doing. He had a secret contingency plan hidden in the guest bedroom safe. He slipped around the corner, moving with desperate, frantic speed. He ripped a heavy oil painting off the wall, punched the code into the hidden wall safe, and yanked the heavy steel door open. Inside sat a black velvet duffel bag stuffed with 6 vintage Rolex watches, thick stacks of bundled $100 bills, and a handful of untraceable bearer bonds. It was his ultimate getaway fund, his golden parachute designed specifically for the moment his fake empire collapsed. He snatched the heavy bag by the handles, slung it over his shoulder, and sprinted back down the hallway, completely abandoning his wife and her ruined family. He bypassed the dining room entirely, moving quickly through the lavish living room toward the massive front doors. He was 10 feet away from freedom. He could already imagine starting over in a country with no extradition treaty. But as he reached the marble foyer, a solid wall of dark gray suits blocked his path. Julian stood dead center, flanked by the 2 other imposing corporate lawyers. They stood shoulder to shoulder, entirely blocking the shattered doorway. DeAndre skidded to a halt on the polished marble, the heavy bag of watches clinking audibly against his hip. "Move out of my way," DeAndre demanded, attempting to summon a scrap of his former authority. His voice shook violently, betraying his absolute terror. "You have no legal right to detain me. I am leaving this property right now." Julian did not flinch. He did not shift his stance by a single inch. He simply looked down at DeAndre with an expression of mild clinical boredom. "You are absolutely free to leave, Mr. Davis," Julian stated, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "But that bag stays here." DeAndre clutched the straps of the duffel bag tighter, his knuckles turning white. "This is my personal property," he spat, his eyes darting frantically toward the windows, searching for an alternative exit. "You cannot touch my personal belongings. You are just corporate lawyers. You are not the police." Julian offered a slow, sharp smile that did not reach his cold eyes. "You are entirely correct, Mr. Davis. We are not law enforcement. We are the legal representatives of Zenith Holdings. And as of 9 o'clock this morning, Zenith Holdings holds the deed to this entire estate and every single physical asset located within its property lines. That includes the furniture, the artwork, the vehicles in the garage, and the stolen luxury watches currently sitting inside that velvet bag." DeAndre took a step back, his chest heaving as the reality of the trap closed tightly around his throat. "Everything in this house is now under the strict legal jurisdiction of Zenith Holdings." Julian continued, stepping forward and holding out an expectant hand. "If you attempt to cross that threshold with a single item that belongs to my client, I will personally ensure you are arrested for grand larceny before you reach the end of the driveway. Hand over the bag." DeAndre stared at Julian's outstretched hand, completely defeated. His shoulders slumped, the fight entirely draining out of his body. He let the heavy velvet bag slide off his shoulder, dropping it onto the marble floor with a muffled thud. He was trapped. He was utterly broken. He slowly raised his hands and backed away, leaving his golden parachute resting at Julian's polished shoes. The absolute finality of Julian's declaration settled over the house like a heavy, suffocating shroud. Calvin was broken. Valerie was destroyed. Chloe was weeping hysterically on the floor, and DeAndre was a trapped rat waiting for the federal authorities to arrive. The elite, untouchable Wilson family had been completely dismantled in a matter of minutes. The silence in the dining room was profound, broken only by Chloe's pathetic, rhythmic sobbing. Then the sharp, authoritative crack of a silver-handled cane striking the hardwood floor snapped everyone back to attention. Grandma B slowly stood up from her chair, leaning heavily onto the cane. Her face was carved from ancient, unforgiving stone. She looked around the ruined room, her eyes lingering on the weeping faces of her son and his pathetic family. She slowly raised her free hand and pointed a trembling, perfectly manicured finger directly at Valerie's face. "You bred a house of thieves," Grandma B declared, her voice vibrating with an ancient, terrifying wrath. "But I have one last card to play. I built this family from the absolute bottom," Grandma B stated, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her son. The heavy silver tip of her cane struck the Persian rug with a muffled thud, yet the sound commanded total obedience. "I scrubbed the linoleum floors of wealthy white folks' houses in 1962, just so I could afford the raw shea butter and lye to mix my very first batch of hair relaxer. I mixed it in a rusty tin bucket in a cramped kitchen with absolutely no hot water. I sold those glass jars out of the trunk of a beat-up Ford. I dragged myself through the darkest days of the civil rights movement, dodging police dogs, enduring the humiliation of segregated streets, and fighting for every single inch of ground I stood on. I bled for this family, Calvin. I swallowed my pride, I took the beatings, and I built a multi-million-dollar haircare empire brick by agonizing brick, so that my bloodline would never have to bow their heads to a single soul on this earth." She stopped right in front of Calvin, her gaze boring a hole straight through his skull. He refused to look up, his shoulders shaking with silent, pathetic sobs. "I handed you an empire forged in actual fire." Grandma B continued, her voice unwavering. "I gave you a heavy, solid gold crown. And what did you do? You traded it for a cheap jester's hat. You married a woman whose only ambition in life was to be accepted by the very people who used to spit on me. You let her turn my legacy into a joke." Grandma B turned her blistering, furious glare onto Valerie, who shrank back against the edge of the dining table. You took my blood legacy, and you turned it into a pathetic country club minstrel show. Grandma B spat, her voice thick with absolute disgust. You spent decades desperately buying overpriced golf memberships, hosting empty charity galas, and kissing up to people who sneer at you behind your backs the second you walk out of the room. You watered down the Wilson name until it stood for absolutely nothing but cheap champagne, fake smiles, and stolen money. You raised a petty thief for a daughter, and you married a spineless coward for a son-in-law. You are a parasite, Valerie. You sucked the lifeblood out of my legacy to fund your ridiculous, pathetic delusions of royalty. Valerie's chest heaved violently. The complete destruction of her character delivered with ruthless precision in front of high-powered corporate lawyers and her ruined family finally snapped the last fragile thread of her sanity. The weeping despair vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a vicious, cornered animal ferocity. She wiped her tear-stained face with the back of her trembling hand, smearing her expensive foundation into a muddy, chaotic mess, and let out a sharp, manic laugh. "You think you can just write us off?" Valerie screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the crystal chandelier above us. "You think you can just hand everything over to this ungrateful dropout and leave us with nothing? You are a delusional, senile old woman." Valerie frantically dug into the hidden zippered compartment of her quilted Chanel bag. Her hands shook with a terrifying, aggressive energy as she pulled out a thick, legally bound document sealed in a heavy protective sleeve. She held it up high, wielding it like a weapon against the entire room. "I knew this day would come," Valerie declared, a triumphant, completely unhinged smile stretching across her face. "I knew your mind was slipping, B. I knew you were losing your grip on reality. That is exactly why I had my personal lawyers draft this document 3 years ago, when you started displaying the very first signs of your cognitive decline. Do you remember when you were in the hospital for your hip replacement? You signed a lot of paperwork that day. This is a comprehensive medical power of attorney signed, witnessed, and legally notarized by a state official." Calvin looked up from his hands, his eyes widening in total confusion as he stared at the paperwork his wife was brandishing. Valerie ignored him, keeping her manic, wide-eyed gaze locked entirely on Grandma B and me. "This document clearly states that if B. Wilson is ever deemed mentally unfit to manage her own medical and financial affairs, her entire estate, all her trusts, and all her remaining corporate voting rights immediately transfer to her sole surviving son, Calvin." Valerie explained, her voice rising to a frantic, victorious pitch. "It is an ironclad contingency plan. It completely overrides any new wills, any sudden transfers of wealth, and whatever fake paperwork Zenith Holdings thinks they have filed. The minute you lose your mind, B. Calvin becomes the absolute sole executor of everything. And looking at you right now, actively destroying your own bloodline and giving away the family fortune to a daughter who hates us, you have clearly lost your mind." Valerie stepped closer aggressively, waving the legal document directly in Grandma B's face. Grandma B did not even blink at the horrific threat of being institutionalized. She stood with the absolute stillness of a predator waiting for its prey to exhaust itself. The pure malice radiating from Valerie would have broken a weaker woman, but B simply watched her daughter-in-law with an expression of cold, clinical detachment. "I will not let you destroy this family just because your brain is rotting," Valerie screamed. "I will call the doctors tonight. I have the chief of psychiatry at Atlanta General Hospital on speed dial. I will have an ambulance pull up to the front doors of this estate right now." She spun around to face Calvin, her eyes blazing with absolute madness. "Stand up, Calvin. Be a man for once in your pathetic life. Look at your mother. She is having a severe psychotic break. She is raving, hallucinating, and threatening to leave her own flesh and blood homeless on the street. That is textbook advanced dementia. We are enacting the medical power of attorney right now. You are going to take control of this estate tonight." Valerie turned her vicious, hateful attention back to Grandma B, her tone dripping with pure, unadulterated malice. "We are putting you in a lockdown facility, B. We will find a nice, secure luxury asylum where you can babble all you want about the 1960s and your rusty tin buckets. We are going to lock you away for your own good. You are going to spend the rest of your miserable life sitting in a wheelchair staring at a blank white wall, heavily medicated, while Calvin and I take back absolute control of this family and fix this massive mess you created. You will have no visitors. You will have no phone calls. You will simply fade away in a locked room while we spend your money to rebuild our lives. The dining room was dead silent. Chloe stopped sobbing, staring up at her mother in sheer, unadulterated horror. DeAndre remained frozen near the marble foyer, clutching his empty hands, entirely forgotten in the wake of Valerie's monstrous threat. Julian and his team of attorneys exchanged a brief, entirely unbothered glance. They had seen desperate heirs try to pull fraudulent medical stunts 1,000 times before, but Valerie's brazen attempt to weaponize a medical facility against her own mother-in-law was a new level of depravity. "You have no power here anymore," Valerie screamed, clutching the document to her chest like an impenetrable shield. "You are legally incompetent. You are a danger to yourself and your legacy. You are completely finished. I run this family now. I hold the keys." I did not flinch. I remained perfectly still, letting Valerie's desperate, toxic words hang in the heavy, suffocating air of the dining room. I casually reached out, sliding my finger across the smooth glass screen of my iPad, and tapped it once to wake the device. "You might want to check the date on that power of attorney, Mom," I said, my voice cutting through her mania like a frozen blade. "Because Grandma and I took a little trip to a federal judge 3 months ago." I slid the glowing screen of my iPad across the polished mahogany table until it bumped gently against Valerie's clenched fists. Julian stepped forward, simultaneously extracting a fresh stack of documents from his briefcase. They were bound in thick black leather and stamped with the unmistakable golden seal of a federal court. He handed a copy directly to Calvin and dropped another right on top of Valerie's outdated, useless paperwork. "You honestly thought I was blind?" Valerie Grandma B asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register. "You thought I would just sit in my parlor and let you circle me like buzzards waiting for a corpse to rot? I built a multi-million-dollar company in an era when bankers would not even look me in the eye. I know how to spot a thief. I knew money was bleeding out of my foundation months ago. I saw Calvin taking out desperate high-interest loans to cover his own sheer incompetence. I knew exactly what you were trying to do with that medical power of attorney. You wanted to lock me in a padded room so you could drain my accounts dry and pretend you were the queens of high society." Grandma B took a slow, agonizing step forward, her cane thumping like a judge's gavel. "So I went to the only person in this family with an ounce of my actual blood in her veins. I went to Zora." I stood tall, smoothing my hands over my linen dress. 3 months ago, I explained, looking down at my mother, Grandma B came to my apartment. We sat at my tiny kitchen table, the one you mocked, and we formulated a plan. She brought me her private ledgers. I deployed Zenith Holdings' top forensic accountants to audit this entire family. We spent 90 days tracking every single cent Calvin wasted, every offshore wire transfer Chloe authorized, and every fraudulent document DeAndre forged. We built a flawless, airtight case against all of you. And then we took a trip downtown. Julian added, his tone utterly devoid of sympathy. We visited a federal judge. We brought along 3 independent, board-certified psychiatrists who evaluated Beatrice Wilson and declared her of exceptionally sound mind and possessing full cognitive function. With their sworn testimony, the judge immediately invalidated your previous medical power of attorney, Mrs. Wilson. The trap slammed shut with a resounding, inescapable echo. Grandma B smiled, a cold, terrifying expression that mirrored my own. "I stripped Calvin of his status as the executor of my estate," she declared. "I revoked every single piece of legal authority you thought you possessed. I transferred full medical power of attorney, full financial power of attorney, and the absolute sole executorship of my entire billion-dollar empire directly to Zora. She controls my healthcare. She controls my trusts. She controls my legacy. You have absolutely no legal standing in my life, and you certainly have no access to my money." Valerie stared down at the black leather binder. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely turn the crisp, heavy pages. She read the federal stamps. She read the signatures of the 3 independent psychiatrists. She read the final binding ruling of the federal judge, completely stripping her of the one weapon she thought would save her. The realization hit her with the force of a speeding freight train. Her legs simply gave out. Valerie collapsed heavily into one of the velvet dining chairs, the binder slipping from her fingers and crashing onto the floor. She pressed both hands over her face, letting out a raw, guttural sob that tore through the dead silence of the room. It was the sound of complete, absolute defeat. Her entire reality had been dismantled brick by brick. There was no loophole. There was no escape hatch. There was no billionaire gravy train left to hijack. Calvin looked completely hollowed out. His skin was the color of wet ash. He stared at me, his own daughter realizing the staggering magnitude of the power I now held over him. Zora owns the debt to this house, Calvin whispered to himself, his voice cracking with dry, raspy despair. She owns Chloe's mortgage. She controls my mother's estate. We have nothing. You have less than nothing, Calvin, I corrected him sharply, refusing to let him wallow in abstract pity. Let me make this incredibly clear for you, so there is no confusion moving forward. Zenith Holdings will not be offering loan modifications. We will not be offering grace periods. You are completely bankrupt. Your credit is entirely frozen. You have zero liquidity. You are sitting in a dining room you no longer own, eating food funded by credit cards you can no longer pay off. You are entirely at my mercy, and I have absolutely none left to give you. You spent my entire life treating me like an ugly, useless dropout. You told me I was a failure because I refused to play your fake country club games. Now you get to live in the reality you created. You get to figure out how to survive without Grandma B's money bailing you out of your own stupidity. Valerie continued to sob uncontrollably, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy, chaotic strands across her tear-soaked face. The glamorous matriarch of the Wilson family was reduced to a weeping, broken mess entirely dependent on the daughter she had spent 27 years trying to erase. While Valerie wept and Calvin stared into the abyss of his ruined future, a sudden, frantic movement caught my eye. DeAndre, who had been standing frozen near the foyer after Julian intercepted his velvet bag of stolen watches, abruptly changed his entire demeanor. The terrified, cornered rat realized that fighting was useless. His golden parachute was gone. His wife was facing federal embezzlement charges. His father-in-law was bankrupt. The sinking ship was entirely submerged. So DeAndre did the only thing a true parasite knows how to do. He searched for a new host. He hastily wiped the nervous sweat from his forehead, straightened his bespoke Italian silk tie, and plastered on a sickeningly smooth, desperate smile. He stepped away from the foyer, ignoring the shattered remains of his family, and walked directly toward me. Zora. DeAndre began, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it into his best corporate pitch tone. Zora, listen to me. This is incredible. What you have built with Zenith Holdings, it is absolutely brilliant. You outsmarted all of us. You played the long game. I respect that. I truly do. Chloe abruptly stopped crying on the floor. She looked up at her husband, her mascara-stained eyes widening in pure, unadulterated shock. DeAndre, what are you doing? She gasped, her voice raspy and broken. DeAndre did not even glance down at his wife. He kept his desperate, calculating eyes locked entirely on me. You are going to need someone who understands the elite corporate landscape. DeAndre continued, taking another tentative step forward, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. You are acquiring massive commercial assets. You are expanding a billion-dollar portfolio. I have a massive network, Zora. I have the contacts. I have the client list. I could be incredibly useful to you. I could be a strategic advisor for Zenith Holdings. We could work together. I can help you manage all of this newly acquired capital. I stared at him. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the man was almost fascinating. He was literally offering to abandon his wife, ignore her impending federal indictment, and go to work for the woman who had just orchestrated their absolute destruction. You want a job? I asked, my voice dangerously soft. Yes? DeAndre nodded eagerly, completely misreading my tone. I can pivot. I am agile in the market. Whatever Chloe did with that foundation money, that was her own poor judgment. I had nothing to do with her charity theft. I am a professional. I can bring real value to your firm. Please, Zora, just give me a consulting position. I looked at him with a level of disgust so profound it made my skin crawl. You are a truly pathetic excuse for a human being, DeAndre. I stated, my voice ringing out with absolute clarity. You steal from your own investors. You orchestrate a massive Ponzi scheme that destroys innocent people's life savings. You attempt to flee this house with a bag full of stolen watches, completely abandoning your wife to face federal charges alone. And when that fails, you immediately drop to your knees and beg the woman you just called a dropout for a paycheck. DeAndre's fake smile completely collapsed. The desperation bled through his eyes as he realized his pitch had failed spectacularly. You have no network, DeAndre. I continued, stepping toward him and forcing him to shrink back. You have a list of victims who are currently preparing class action lawsuits against you. You have absolutely zero loyalty, zero integrity, and zero value to Zenith Holdings. I would not hire you to scrub the toilets in my commercial properties. Chloe let out a high, ear-piercing scream. She scrambled up from the floor and lunged at DeAndre, pounding her fists violently against his chest. You traitor! She shrieked, spit flying from her lips as she tore at his expensive suit jacket. You coward! You tried to sell me out to her. You tried to leave me here to take the fall. I hate you. I hate you. DeAndre grabbed her wrists, roughly shoving her backward. Get off me, you crazy thief! He yelled, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. I am not going down for your mistakes. I am looking out for myself. They turned on each other with the vicious, unrestrained fury of starving animals. The facade of their perfect elite marriage was entirely stripped away, leaving only two desperate criminals tearing each other to pieces in the middle of a dining room they no longer owned. Calvin tried to intervene, shouting at DeAndre to let go of his daughter, while Valerie simply covered her ears and wept louder, unable to cope with the sheer volume of the chaos. Julian stepped seamlessly to my side, his eyes scanning the chaotic brawl unfolding before us. We have the eviction paperwork ready for signature, Ms. Wilson, Julian said quietly, ensuring only I could hear him over the shouting. Would you like me to have the security team physically remove them from the premises tonight? I watched my family tear themselves apart. I watched the empire of lies crumble into dust. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel an ounce of regret. I only felt the cold, hard satisfaction of long-awaited justice. Before I could answer Julian, a sudden piercing sound sliced through the heavy oak doors of the estate. The distant wail of sirens. The sound grew rapidly louder, multiplying until it sounded like a dozen vehicles tearing up the long, manicured driveway. Suddenly, vibrant flashes of red and blue light swept violently across the dining room windows, illuminating the terrified, frozen faces of the Wilson family in harsh, unforgiving neon colors. The heavy, ornate oak front doors of the estate did not simply open. They exploded inward with a deafening crash that shook the massive crystal chandelier suspended above our heads. A highly coordinated swarm of men and women, clad in dark tactical gear and navy blue windbreakers, poured aggressively into the grand marble foyer. The bold, bright yellow letters spelling out FBI across their broad backs stood out vividly against the soft, elegant pastels of Valerie's carefully curated, outrageously expensive home. Heavy combat boots trampled relentlessly over the imported silk Persian rugs, leaving trails of outside dirt on the immaculate floors. Authoritative orders were barked with absolute, uncompromising precision, echoing loudly off the vaulted ceilings and instantly drowning out the pathetic rhythmic sobbing of my ruined family. Julian remained a statue of perfect composure amidst the sudden hurricane of law enforcement flooding the space. He smoothly stepped aside, adjusting his gold wire glasses, and allowed a senior federal agent to take the dead center of the dining room. The agent's eyes locked onto DeAndre with terrifying laser-focused precision. Calvin stumbled backward in shock, his hip knocking over a crystal wine glass that shattered violently against the polished hardwood floor, sending a spray of dark red liquid across the baseboards. Valerie let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp, pressing both of her shaking hands tightly over her mouth as the undeniable reality of the flashing lights outside fully materialized inside her untouchable sanctuary. While you were busy panicking over a few missed commercial mortgage payments, Zenith Holdings was quietly conducting a microscopic, relentless audit of every single financial entity connected to this family. Julian explained, his deep baritone voice projecting clearly and effortlessly over the chaotic commotion of the raid. We did not merely acquire your toxic real estate debt, Calvin. Our elite team of forensic accountants uncovered the massive sprawling network of offshore shell companies DeAndre created to funnel stolen capital. DeAndre shook his head wildly from side to side, his eyes darting frantically toward the shattered front doors, calculating an escape route that did not exist. It is a lie, DeAndre stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, cowardly squeal. It is all a massive corporate misunderstanding. I have lawyers. I can explain the fund transfers. It is rampant wire fraud, Mr. Davis. Julian corrected him coldly, his expression entirely devoid of sympathy. It is a textbook, highly illegal Ponzi scheme. It is money laundering on a federal level. When our legal team compiled the final 400-page dossier detailing your exact financial crimes, we did not simply keep it to ourselves for leverage. We handed every single bank statement, every forged charity invoice, and every decrypted offshore email directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation early Tuesday morning. They have been sitting on federal arrest warrants all week, simply waiting for the perfect coordinated moment to execute them. I believe tonight provided the ideal gathering for everyone involved. The senior agent did not waste another second listening to Julian's explanation. He lunged forward, closing the distance between the marble foyer and the dining table in 3 massive, purposeful strides. DeAndre let out a pathetic, terrified yelp and turned his body to run, but he did not even make it 2 steps toward the hallway. The federal agent grabbed him roughly by the shoulder of his bespoke $5,000 Italian silk suit and slammed him violently face first against the custom mahogany wall paneling. The heavy impact rattled the antique imported china plates displayed on the nearby shelves, causing several to teeter dangerously near the edge. Chloe screamed a horrific, blood-curdling sound that tore through her throat as she watched her wealthy, arrogant husband get completely manhandled like a common street thug. She scrambled backward on the floor, pressing her back against the baseboards, entirely paralyzed by the sudden violence invading her perfect life. "Put your hands behind your back right now," the agent roared, driving his heavy forearm hard into the back of DeAndre's neck to keep him securely pinned against the expensive woodwork. The sharp, unmistakable metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around DeAndre's wrists echoed sharply through the dining room, finalizing his absolute undeniable loss of freedom. DeAndre thrashed weakly and uselessly against the wall, his carefully constructed persona of the elite, untouchable venture capitalist evaporated entirely into the thin air, leaving behind only a terrified, sniveling coward. He realized in that exact moment that he was going to a federal penitentiary, and true to his deeply parasitic nature, he immediately decided he was not going down alone. "It was not just me!" DeAndre screamed, his voice muffled and desperate against the mahogany paneling. He twisted his head around his panicked, bloodshot eyes, locking directly onto Calvin. "Do not just arrest me." He knew about the accounts. Calvin knew absolutely everything. Calvin froze in his tracks, the remaining color completely draining from his already ashen face. "Shut up, you pathetic rat!" Calvin bellowed, stepping forward with his fists raised in a futile display of bravado, but 2 more armed federal agents instantly stepped into his path, forcing the family patriarch to halt. "He is my co-conspirator!" DeAndre shrieked desperately, throwing his father-in-law to the wolves in a frantic bid to save his own skin. He signed the corporate guarantees. He approved the fraudulent commercial loans, using his prestigious law firm's credentials to legitimize the fake equity fund. I have his signatures on the wire transfers. He helped me hide the missing capital when the foundation audit started. He is just as guilty as I am. He planned the entire expansion, The senior agent turned his head slowly, his cold, calculating gaze shifting from the weeping coward pinned against the wall to the trembling, arrogant patriarch standing at the head of the dining table. "Take him too," the agent commanded with a sharp, definitive nod to his subordinates. Calvin's jaw dropped wide open. He looked frantically at Valerie, then at Grandma B, and finally at me, searching wildly for anyone to intervene and assert their status to stop this nightmare. No one moved a single muscle. The two federal agents grabbed Calvin roughly by the arms, spinning the proud, boastful master of the estate around and slamming him hard down onto his own lavish dining room table. His cheek pressed uncomfortably against the spilled red wine and the scattered, completely useless legal documents Valerie had brought. The steel handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, binding the great Calvin Wilson like a common street criminal. He squeezed his eyes shut tightly, tears of ultimate soul-crushing humiliation leaking out and mixing with the wine as an officer loudly and clearly recited his Miranda rights for the entire room to hear. Valerie watched her husband get forcefully dragged away from the grand dining table. She watched the federal agents march him roughly toward the flashing red and blue lights waiting out in the circular driveway. Her sprawling luxury estate was filled with muddy boots, armed officers, static crackling from police radios, and the absolute total destruction of her high society fantasy. The elite country club memberships, the fake charity galas, the perfectly manicured family image she had bled dry to protect it, was all completely dead. She spun around wildly, her manicured hands tearing frantically at her perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive updo. She looked at Chloe, who was curled tightly into a fetal position on the floor, weeping, and entirely incapable of forming a single coherent sentence. She looked at Grandma B, who stood tall, unyielding, and unforgiving, her weathered face etched with the cold, satisfying triumph of ancient justice, finally being served to those who deserved it. Finally, Valerie looked at me. I was the only person left standing in the room holding any actual power. I owned the house she was standing in. I owned the massive, suffocating debt that had ruined them. I held the permanent legal keys to the multi-billion-dollar empire she had spent her entire adult life trying to steal from my grandmother. Valerie let out a desperate, animalistic wail that scraped against the walls. She scrambled awkwardly across the Persian rug on her hands and knees, completely ignoring the federal agents moving methodically around her, and threw herself violently at my feet. She fell heavily onto the floor, her expensive designer dress pooling awkwardly and getting stained by the dirt from the officer's boots. Her hands shot out rapidly, her trembling fingers wrapping tightly around the hem of my simple, unbranded linen dress in a white-knuckled, desperate grip. "Zora, please." Valerie sobbed, her face completely ruined by thick streaks of black mascara and smeared, muddy foundation. "Please, you have to stop this. You have to tell them to stop. You have to save him." I looked down at the pathetic woman who had spent 27 years ensuring I felt like a worthless, ugly burden. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and begging for a mercy she had never once extended to me. "You have the money," Zora Valerie pleaded, her voice cracking into a desperate, pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You have Zenith Holdings. You control your grandmother's accounts. You can hire the best corporate defense lawyers in the country. You can pay his bail tonight. You can fix this entire mess. He is your father, Zora. You cannot just stand there and watch them take your own father away in handcuffs like a criminal." She tugged frantically and aggressively at my dress, trying to force me to look down into her weeping, pathetic eyes. When I remained completely silent and perfectly still, her desperation morphed rapidly back into the toxic, manipulative tactics she had weaponized against me my entire life. "I am your mother," Valerie screamed, her voice echoing shrilly and desperately in the chaotic room, fighting to be heard over the police radios. "I gave you life. I carried you in my womb for 9 months. I put a roof over your head when you were a child. I fed you. You owe us, Zora. You owe this family your loyalty. You cannot just take our home, steal our legacy, and throw us to the wolves. You are a Wilson. You have a moral duty to protect us. Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Do not be so heartless. Do not turn your back on the people who raised you. We are all you have left in this world." I looked down at her tear-soaked, hypocritical face, feeling absolutely nothing but profound, chilling disgust. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I slowly stepped back firmly, pulling the hem of my linen dress completely out of her desperate, grasping hands. "I owe you exactly what you gave me when I was starving, Mom," I said, my voice cold, steady, and devoid of any mercy. "Nothing. You have exactly 60 minutes to pack your bags." The federal agents moved with terrifying clinical efficiency. DeAndre was violently yanked away from the mahogany paneling, his expensive Italian loafers scrambling uselessly against the polished floor as two massive agents dragged him toward the exit. He wept openly, his face contorted in absolute panic, begging anyone who would listen for a deal. Calvin offered no such resistance. The sheer shock of his sudden, precipitous fall from grace had rendered him completely catatonic. His hands were bound tightly behind his back, his shoulders slumped in ultimate defeat as he was marched out of the dining room. The red and blue police lights flashed violently across his pale, vacant face as he was shoved roughly into the back of an armored federal transport vehicle. The heavy front doors remained open, letting in a bitter, freezing draft, but the chaos was far from over. The second the police vehicles pulled away from the circular driveway, Julian calmly stepped forward and snapped his fingers. A team of 6 private security contractors, all dressed in immaculate tailored black suits, filed into the grand foyer. They moved with silent military precision, fanning out across the ground floor. Julian adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked directly at Valerie and Chloe, who were still huddled together on the Persian rug. "The authorities have secured the individuals responsible for the act of fraud," Julian stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "However, Zenith Holdings has officially assumed full control of this estate and all associated assets. Every single luxury item in this house, the art, the jewelry, the designer clothing, the imported furniture, was purchased using funds embezzled directly from Beatrice Wilson's trusts or acquired through fraudulent commercial loans. Therefore, they are classified as stolen assets. They are no longer yours." One of the security guards stepped forward and dropped a heavy, thick roll of black industrial garbage bags onto the marble floor. The dull thud sounded like a death knell. "You may pack basic necessities," Julian continued coldly. "Unbranded clothing, essential toiletries, and personal hygiene items. Everything else remains on the premises. You have exactly 45 minutes. 5. Chloe let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She scrambled to her feet, her high heels slipping wildly on the floor, and sprinted frantically toward the grand sweeping staircase leading to the master suites. 2 security guards immediately fell into step right behind her, their heavy boots thudding rhythmically against the carpeted stairs. I followed slowly, watching from the landing, as Chloe burst into her massive walk-in closet. It was a cavernous space, larger than most apartments, lined wall to wall with customized glass display cases holding millions of dollars in haute couture. Chloe lunged desperately for the center display, her manicured hands grabbing the handles of a rare Himalayan crocodile Birkin bag. She clutched the immensely valuable leather to her chest, her breathing shallow and ragged. "I need this," she whispered frantically, her eyes wide and crazed. "I just need to sell this one bag, and I can afford a lawyer, I can afford a hotel, please." "Oh." The security guard did not speak. He simply reached out. His massive hand gripped the strap of the Birkin and effortlessly pried it from her shaking fingers. He placed it back onto the glass shelf and handed her a black plastic garbage bag. The reality of her situation finally truly hit her. The illusion of her elite, untouchable wealth evaporated, leaving her completely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of genuine poverty. Chloe collapsed onto the floor of her closet, burying her face in her hands. The guttural, agonizing wails that tore from her throat were not the sounds of a woman losing her possessions. They were the sounds of a woman realizing she no longer had an identity. Without the designer labels, without the stolen wealth, she was absolutely nothing. She wept as she was forced to dig past rows of silk blouses and cashmere sweaters, packing plain cotton t-shirts and faded sweatpants into the cheap, crinkling plastic bag. Valerie was faring no better in the master suite across the hall. I watched from the doorway as she frantically tried to slip a heavy velvet box containing diamond drop earrings into the pocket of her slacks. The security guard standing behind her immediately caught her arm firmly, forcing her hand open and dropping the velvet box onto the vanity. Valerie's face twisted into a mask of pure humiliated rage, but the guard simply handed her an empty garbage bag. It was a sterile, clinical, and utterly degrading dismantling of their entire lives. Valerie stared down into the gaping dark abyss of her plastic garbage bag. It contained a toothbrush, a pair of practical walking shoes, and a few plain sweaters. The stark, undeniable visual of her entire life being reduced to a single trash bag finally broke her carefully maintained facade. She dropped the bag onto the plush carpeting and sprinted out of the bedroom, her footsteps frantic and heavy as she rushed back down the grand staircase. Grandma B was standing quietly near the roaring fireplace in the main parlor, leaning heavily on her silver-tipped cane. She was staring into the dancing orange flames, watching the embers burn with an expression of deep, immovable serenity. Valerie burst into the parlor, her chest heaving violently, her eyes wild and bloodshot. Valerie cried out, her voice cracking with raw, desperate manipulation. She threw herself forward, stopping just inches from the older woman. "You cannot do this. You cannot let her do this to us. It is the week before Christmas. We are family. I spent 30 years in this house. I raised your grandchildren in these halls. I hosted your charity dinners. I took care of your son. You cannot throw us out onto the street in the dead of winter. Where is your Christian charity? Where is your forgiveness? I am your daughter-in-law. I am a mother. Please be. Please look at me." Grandma B did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She slowly turned her head, fixing Valerie with a gaze as hard, cold, and impenetrable as polished obsidian. She looked at the woman who had plotted to throw her into a locked psychiatric facility, who had drained her legacy to fund country club memberships, who had stood by and smiled while I was treated like a worthless pariah. Grandma B looked Valerie up and down, processing the weeping, pathetic display of a cornered predator begging for mercy. Then, with slow, deliberate, and agonizing precision, Grandma B turned her back. She faced the fireplace once more, completely shutting Valerie out of her existence. The physical dismissal was far more violent and devastating than a slap across the face. It was the absolute total erasure of Valerie's presence. I stepped into the parlor, my heels clicking sharply against the marble threshold. Valerie spun around to face me, her eyes blazing with a toxic mixture of hatred and sheer terror. I raised my left arm, slowly pulling back the sleeve of my linen dress to reveal my sleek silver watch. I tapped the glass face once with my index finger. "You have exactly 14 minutes, I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the vaulted ceiling. Valerie let out a shrieking, unhinged scream. "You are a monster!" she yelled, pointing a trembling accusatory finger directly at my face. "You are a cold-blooded sociopath. You planned this just to torture us. You are enjoying watching us suffer. You are sick." I simply stood there, my hands loosely clasped in front of me. My posture was perfectly straight, my breathing slow and measured. The contrast between us was stark and undeniable. Valerie was unraveling into a chaotic, screaming, hyperventilating mess, frantically grasping at invisible lifelines that no longer existed. I was the picture of absolute, terrifying calm. I let her toxic words wash over me, completely unaffected by her desperate venom. I watched her scream until her voice went hoarse, waiting with the patience of a ticking clock. 12 minutes, I announced smoothly, entirely ignoring her outburst. The private security team physically herded Valerie and Chloe out of the parlor and toward the grand marble foyer. The mother and daughter looked entirely unrecognizable from the polished elite socialites who had sat at the dining table just an hour prior. Their expensive, heavy makeup was streaked and muddy from relentless crying. Their meticulously styled hair was matted with nervous sweat and chaotic tangles. They were each clutching a cheap black plastic garbage bag filled with basic toiletries, plain underwear, and whatever unbranded generic clothing they were permitted to salvage. Julian stood by the entrance, his expression completely blank. He reached out and grasped the heavy brass handles of the massive double oak front doors, pulling them wide open. A sudden violent blast of freezing, bitter December wind whipped violently into the warm foyer. The icy air bit harshly through their thin, fashionable designer clothing, making them both shiver uncontrollably. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers were entirely gone now, having hauled Calvin and DeAndre off to a federal holding facility. The driveway was empty. All that remained were the harsh, unforgiving, bright white security spotlights, illuminating the long frozen expanse of the concrete driveway leading down to the iron front gates. Chloe hesitated at the threshold, her shoulders shaking violently as the freezing air hit her bare skin. She looked out into the pitch-black darkness beyond the gates. The reality of her immediate future slammed into her with brutal force. She had no car. The luxury SUVs had been seized by the authorities. She had no driver to call. She had absolutely no cash for a taxi, and her platinum credit cards were entirely frozen. Worse still, she had no friends who would ever answer her frantic phone calls once the morning news broke about the massive federal indictment and the Ponzi scheme. She was stepping out into the freezing night with nothing but a trash bag. Valerie grabbed her daughter's arm tightly. Her face had hardened into a tight, bitter mask of sheer animalistic survival. She yanked Chloe roughly forward, dragging her out over the marble threshold and onto the frost-covered front porch. They stumbled down the wide stone steps together, their thin heels clicking awkwardly against the icy pavement. I stood perfectly still in the center of the grand foyer, watching them take their first slow, agonizing steps down the long, freezing driveway. I did not offer a coat. I did not offer a taxi. I did not say a single word of goodbye. I simply stepped forward, grasped the heavy brass handles of the massive oak doors, and pulled them shut with a definitive thunderous slam. The heavy thud of the deadbolts engaging echoed loudly through the cavernous, newly emptied mansion, permanently locking them out in the cold. The heavy silence of the great hall quickly settled around me, washing away the lingering chaos of the night. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the quiet, peaceful air. Grandma B stepped slowly out from the shadows of the parlor, her cane tapping softly against the polished marble floor. She approached me and placed a warm, incredibly steady hand heavily on my shoulder. "It is done," baby Grandma B said softly, her voice carrying a profound tone of absolute finality and deep ancestral pride. "But there is one last piece of business we absolutely need to handle tonight. Come with me to the study." I followed her through the silent, cavernous halls, our footsteps muffled by the thick antique runners. The heavy mahogany doors of her private study clicked shut behind us, sealing us in a space that smelled of old paper, rich leather, and decades of relentless ambition. Grandma B did not sit behind her imposing desk. Instead, she walked directly toward the towering oil portrait of my late grandfather hanging on the far wall. She pressed a hidden latch, swinging the heavy frame aside to reveal a massive steel vault. With slow, practiced movements, she dialed the combination. The heavy metal door groaned open. She reached inside and pulled out a thick, legal-bound master trust document, its edges softened by years of careful handling. She placed it squarely on the center of her desk and looked up at me. "I am not simply giving you my bank account, Zora," she said, her voice echoing with the weight of generations. "That is just money. Anyone can spend money. I am giving you the foundation. This document legally merges my entire historic cosmetic empire directly into Zenith Holdings. We are combining my manufacturing lines, my international distribution networks, and my global patents with your commercial real estate portfolio. You are not just a billionaire now. You are the sole CEO of the largest Black-owned corporate conglomerate in the United States of America." She tapped the thick stack of paper with her silver ring. "I built this from a tin bucket," she whispered fiercely. "You built your firm from a cramped apartment. We are the exact same, Zora. The crown was always meant for you." The wheels of federal justice grind exceedingly slow for the poor, but they snap shut like a steel trap when a billionaire provides the evidence. The fall of the Wilson family was swift, absolute, and highly televised. 6 months later, the courtroom sketch artist captured every humiliating second. DeAndre stood before a federal judge stripped of his custom Italian suits and wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He wept openly as the gavel fell, sentencing him to 15 hard years in a federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud and operating a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. There was no country club prison for him. Calvin did not even have the spine to fight. Completely broken by his sudden descent into poverty and the overwhelming evidence Zenith Holdings handed to the feds, my father took a cowardly plea deal. He signed a full confession implicating himself in every fraudulent commercial loan and surrendered his legal license forever. The judge handed him 5 years, citing his complete betrayal of his fiduciary duty. But federal prison was almost a mercy compared to the absolute social slaughter awaiting Valerie and Chloe. Their elite Jack and Jill circle did not just drop them, they actively and publicly erased them. Their names were scrubbed from every charity gala roster, their calls instantly blocked by the very women they used to sip champagne with. Without my grandmother's trust fund paying their bills, gravity took over. Today, Valerie and Chloe live in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. The drywall is peeling, the heating is entirely unreliable, and they spend their nights battling relentless cockroach infestations. The glamorous matriarch who once mocked my apartment now stands on her aching feet for 9 hours a day, ringing up discounted sweaters at a big-box retail store for federal minimum wage. Chloe works the exact same shift 2 aisles over her hands, blistered from unpacking cardboard boxes, completely devoid of her stolen Birkin bags. They ride the public bus home in absolute miserable silence, trapped in the prison of the poverty they always believed they were too good for. I stood in the dead center of my breathtaking glass-walled corner office, at the very top of the Zenith Holdings Tower. The afternoon sun caught the sleek edges of the modern furniture, casting warm golden light across the massive architectural blueprints spread across my desk. I looked out over the sprawling, pulsing city below me. A city where I now owned entire skylines, residential blocks, and commercial districts. A city I was actively rebuilding on my own terms. I turned away from the glass, looking directly forward. People spend their entire lives absolutely terrified of being the black sheep of their family. They will shrink themselves down, silence their own voices, and endure endless suffocating abuse just to keep a seat at a table where they are secretly despised. They let toxic people dictate their worth because they are too afraid of the cold. But what they never tell you is that the cold is exactly what hardens you. Being the outcast, the disappointment, the one who refuses to conform to their pathetic, fragile delusions, that is not a punishment. It is an education. Being the black sheep is just the universe preparing you to become the goat. You learn how to survive on nothing. You learn how to fight in the dark. And most importantly, you learn how to build your own table so you never have to beg for a seat again. My family thought I was a joke because I refused to play their country club games. They thought they could strip me of my dignity and leave me with nothing. They tried to bury me to elevate themselves. But they forgot one thing. I own the dirt. Fade to black.